Hello and welcome to today's Here's to Your Health podcast. I'm your host, Don Lintzman. Today, last podcast of 2024, and I am blessed to have Heather Rasmussen with me today. Heather is the Chief Officer for Quality and Ancillary Services here at CCMH, including infection prevention, and in fact, that is what we are going to be discussing today. So Heather, thank you very much for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me, Don.
We have had lots of discussion over the last couple of years, actually beginning in 2020. I don't really think infection prevention got to be much of a deal until after COVID hit.
Right.
And we've talked about it a lot since then. But let's have that continued discussion today. In the news, there's been a significant amount of discussion about various illnesses, and we know there's many airborne illnesses, especially in the wintertime. But let's talk about what we're seeing, first of all, across the country in a very general way, and then let's talk a little bit about what we're seeing more specifically here in Denison and Crawford County.
Sure. I think a lot of people are hearing about the trifecta, so influenza, COVID, and RSV. Of course, we're seeing it across the country. Here in Iowa, we're starting to see it. We're getting kind of into our flu season now, so definitely we are starting to see a little bit more positive flu cases. Influenza A, it'll eventually turn to influenza B like it seems to every year, but we are seeing a little uptick in flu and COVID and RSV. So what the country is seeing, we're starting to see here in Iowa as well.
Let's talk a little bit about the flu very specifically. I know that this year's flu shot was a little different than in the past.
Right.
And I'm wondering if that has had any effect on the incidence of flu that we're seeing so far.
No, I don't think so. The last several years it's been a quadrivalent flu shot, so it was 2 A's, 2 B's. This year it's 2 A's and 1 B. So when they look to make the flu shot, they look to see what has circulated, what have we seen in the past, and the 1B we haven't really seen, so they took that out of the flu shot. And really, we typically see a lot of flu A here. We do, late January, early February, it kind of starts to move over to influenza B, but not near what we see for influenza A. So we do still have the 2 A's in our flu shot that we are getting this year.
And again, what you're saying is not much in terms of flu so far.
No, we're starting to see it. Yep.
So let's move on to COVID, because that's something else that's been in the news again recently. I know that COVID continues to be highly contagious, and I do know that there's additional vaccinations for that. Your take on where we're at today with COVID?
We are, it seems to be a little bit cyclical, just like influenza. I would have to say right now we're seeing more influenza and RSV over COVID. Obviously, we still do have the COVID cases, but I don't know if that's because people aren't getting tested for COVID, or their symptoms are to where they can manage it at home and aren't seeing their provider to be tested. Obviously, there's over-the-counter COVID tests, and if they're testing at home, obviously we don't have those results. So,
is it possible that with all of these different and varying infections and airborne illnesses and everything, that one crowds out the others? Does that happen?
I don't know that one crowds out the other. It's just the season. We're definitely in our influenza and RSV season. We've typically seen COVID at the beginning of schools. When school starts again and kids are back together again, the virus is there and it's highly contagious, so it starts to see it in our schools a little bit. But I'm not surprised that we're not seeing as much COVID, again, because of the tests that people can pick up at the local pharmacies and do the testing at home.
My guest on the podcast today is Heather Rasmussen. She is the Chief Officer for Quality and Ancillary Services here at CCMH, including infection prevention. We're talking about airborne illnesses here at the end of the year. We're getting into that colder time. I've seen the long-range forecast. It certainly looks like we're going to have temperatures trending downward over the next few weeks. I think one thing that has kept the communication of these diseases down a little bit is the fact that the weather actually has been relatively mild. So I think we've had people outside. Right. There hasn't been so much of this congregating indoors. On the other hand, I'm not so sure that same sort of mild weather doesn't allow these diseases to continue to propagate themselves.
Right.
So is there something to be said for milder weather and people outside, or is that a figment of my imagination?
When the weather's nice, people tend to be outside, and that's what the CDC and all the experts say is if you can do your holidays outside, do them outside. If you can open the windows in your house, open the windows in your house, use an air purifier. And when it is nice outside, we tend to kind of migrate outside to enjoy the weather before we know that Iowa cold's going to start coming. And we've had Thanksgiving, we had Christmases, we have people that congregate. Like you said, it's starting to get cold, so people are going to go back indoors and be in close encounter with each other. And people forget that not only is it that I can pass, if I have COVID, I can pass it to you, but I can also pass it to the environment. Door handles, drinking fountains, if I don't use my cup if I have COVID. So it's not just human to human transmission, you can get human to environment as well.
So let's talk about environment for just a second.
Sure.
There has been so much discussion about the bird flu. And I have family members who work on chicken farms and they do eggs and they take lots of precautions. They wear the full body gear, the PPE, the personal protective equipment that we talk about. What is the hazard risk for human beings from the bird flu?
So to date, there hasn't been a human to human transmission of the avian flu. It's more chickens or some cows as well. I know that there's been some talk because in Iowa there's the first human avian flu, but that was from a commercial chicken flock. So, it's those things that you got to protect yourself if you're going to work in that environment to protect yourself. But to date, there hasn't been any human to human transmission of the avian flu.
So for a moment of levity, what you're telling me is stay away from the commercial chickens. The non-commercial chickens, you're good.
Right, well, eggs in your grocery store and all that good stuff, they're still okay.
Okay, good.
So you can have your eggs in the morning, Don.
I'm going to guess that I can't get bird flu from a cow. I know that there are dairy farmers who I think in the Northeast have spent some time with cows that have had the avian flu, and I know that there's been at least one documented case of a farmer who on a dairy farm who has contracted the avian flu through one of his milk cows. But I think that the transmission level for all of this has got to be infinitesimal.
It is. Yes. It's not something that, as an infection preventionist in a hospital, that I'm too worried about. It's just one of those things that if you protect yourself when you're in that environment, no human to human transmission yet. Doesn't say it won't come, but right now that's where we're sitting. So
my guest on the podcast today is Heather Rasmussen, Chief Officer for Quality and Ancillary Services here at CCMH, including infection prevention. We're talking about airborne illnesses here at the end of the year and looking into 2025. One thing we haven't talked about yet are things like RSV, pneumonia, and shingles. So let's start with RSV. I know that there's an inoculation for that, both for adults and for children. So let's review that for people and maybe what they should be thinking about as we go into 2025.
So there is an immunization now for RSV. Actually, pregnant moms can get it. There's a certain time frame in their pregnancy that they can get it, and if they get it during their pregnancy, their infant doesn't necessarily have to. If for some reason you're not able to get it when you're pregnant, the RSV vaccine is available for infants and for older adults. You got to think of immunocompromised. Our infants are born, they don't have much of an immune system yet, especially preemies. You got to be careful around them to make sure that you're not bringing RSV. RSV is pretty common. It's like, you feel like you have the common cold. For healthy adults, we might not even know we have RSV. We might think that we have a cold, but we have to be cognizant of the people that we're around. I know myself, I have a preemie grandson. He was born at 34 weeks, so we are very careful when we're around him. If you have a sniffle, we don't want to be around him or anything. Same with elderly parents. If you have a sniffle, just be very mindful of who you're going to be around with RSV.
Yeah, and again, just to reiterate, that the inoculation for RSV is not for everybody.
Right. No. It's for infants and older people those that are immunocompromised.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit then about pneumonia, because I know that especially for older adults, the pneumonia vaccination, I think is an excellent thing to be doing this time of year.
Yeah. Typically it's 65 and older to get the pneumonia vaccine. I've been reading some articles that say people as, I say young as 50, because that's what I am.
Or as old as 65,
exactly,
which is me.
Exactly. But it's always a good idea to take a look and see what you're eligible for when you're older. Like you say, the pneumonia vaccine, the high-dose flu shot you can get when you're 65 and older, and then that kind of leads us into the shingles as well. That is 50 and older for shingles.
And most insurances cover shingle shots, cover the pneumonia shots. I think if there's one thing that I would suggest to anybody who would consider themselves a senior today, that if you haven't gotten the shingle shot, you haven't gotten the pneumonia shot, I would encourage them to do that.
Absolutely. I would definitely encourage you to talk to your provider to get those shots done. Definitely.
Yeah, it's not like you've got a small window to do it.
Right.
But this is a good time of the year when it comes to mind.
That's right.
Finally today, Heather, let's just finish by talking a little bit about the infection prevention part of this and the things that we can do to protect ourselves from these sorts of airborne illnesses.
Absolutely. We've been talking about how to protect ourselves since the beginning of COVID. It's, washing your hands. Washing your hands is so easy, but yet the single most important means of preventing the spread of infection. So wash your hands.
And I'm going to give you a really, really quick statistic on this. I just saw this the other day. As much as we've been talking about this over the last 5 years, the percentage of people who routinely wash their hands is only 10%. Only 10% of people routinely wash their hands. And what you're saying is absolutely true. It is the one thing that we can do that can prevent a lot of these respiratory illnesses and us passing that along to someone else.
Absolutely. I can't stress hand washing enough. Cover your cough, cover your sneeze. If you're ill, stay home from school, don't go to work. Be careful of who you're around during, if you have a cold. I know Christmases and Thanksgiving, everybody wants to hug on the babies and kiss the babies and hug everybody. Sometimes we might have to refrain from doing that. That's an easy way to get sick, but yeah, just protect yourself and protect those around you. And if you're sick, it's always a good idea to maybe change your toothbrush after you're done with your illness and make sure you're cleaning your environment as well.
Yeah. So my toothbrush goes out at the end of the year because I usually do that. That December 31st, it goes and I get a new, it's like turning over a new leaf. I get a new toothbrush and, the world seems like a great thing.
Absolutely.
As we finish up today, one thing maybe we haven't talked about much, especially for older folks, is the need for a regular checkup. And I'm not saying this is necessarily related to any of the other illnesses that we're talking about today, but I just think that a regular check-in with your provider, whoever that might happen to be, is a really good way to get that sort of baseline on your health and make sure that you're just in good shape as we start the coming year.
I couldn't agree with you more, Don. Just that good, annual physical that makes sure that you're in tip-top shape is the way to go. Absolutely.
Heather, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you for having me, Don. I appreciate it.
My guest on the podcast today is Heather Rasmussen, Chief Officer for Quality and Ancillary Services here at CCMH, including infection prevention. We've been talking today about airborne illnesses, and we encourage everybody to wash your hands, cover your cough, and to stay away from folks who are sick, and if you're sick, to stay away from other people so that we don't continue to pass those things around. We want to make sure that everybody is healthy and happy as we go into 2025. I'm Don Lintzman, your host for the Here's to Your Health podcast. Thank you for listening today. Have a great day.